Imagine the year's 1840, and you're a bonny sea captain in the far South Pacific when you come upon an incomprehensibly large wall of ice. It's a mile high and stretches as far as the eye can see in each direction. So you sail to the right to see if you can find a way around it, and you sail and you sail and you sail, and no matter how far you go, it never ends. And in fact, you wind up right back where you started. It is a literally impenetrable ice wall that you can never cross. Obviously, this is where the world ends. And obviously, this ice wall was built to keep us from falling off the edge of the Earth. And obviously, the world is flat. Except no, any bonny sea captain worth his salt would have known that the Earth was round in 1840. He would have known that he was traveling around in a circle. Nobody thought Antarctica was the end of the world. But in terms of accessibility, it might as well have been. Antarctica is a harsh, punishing, deadly place that's next to impossible to survive. So even though the world did not end at Antarctica, it is kind of like a new world begins. There's a reason NASA trains astronauts for future Mars missions in Antarctica. It's basically another planet down there. People have only taken up residence in Antarctica in the last 100 years. It's still very much unexplored lands. In the old days, unexplored lands were rife with legends and myths and speculations. There be dragons and whatnot. And Antarctica is no different today. Yeah, I started looking into it and I found a mountain of wild stories and mysteries surrounding Antarctica. So in this video, let's take a look at the single most mysterious place on planet Earth and get to the bottom of what's going on down there. If there's one word to describe Antarctica, it's desolate. An endless landscape of white snow and ice, simultaneously one of the driest places on Earth and home to 60% of the Earth's fresh water. All of it locked up in an ice sheet that covers 99.6% of the continent. A continent that's way bigger than you might think. In most map projections, you only see a little sliver of landmass at the bottom of the map, or it gets divided up in some way. But it's more than twice the size of Australia, and big enough to cover the United States, Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico, and most of the southern Canadian provinces. And all of it under an ice sheet that averages 2,160 meters thick. That's 1.3 miles high. Average. It's also the windiest place on Earth, with an average wind speed of 10 knots, but it can reach up to 80 knots or 96 miles an hour due to something called katabatic winds, which are basically caused by cold, dense air being funneled through the valleys in the landscape. It's also extremely isolated, surrounded by some of the largest oceans in the world, with the mainland more than 1,000 miles away from the closest inhabited continent. The closest point being the Antarctic Peninsula that reaches out to within 600 miles of Tierra del Fuego in Argentina. And of course between them is the Drake Passage, which is considered one of the roughest areas of ocean in the world. Because of course it is. Oh, it's also old. And lakey. There are about 400 underground lakes in Antarctica. Or under ice, I guess. Scientists started finding these lakes in the 1970s using radar, seismic, and satellite technologies, and some of these are over 3 kilometers deep in the ice. And then in the 1990s, Russian scientists discovered a lake that they called Lake Vostok. This is the 6th largest lake by volume in the world. And for some reason it's not ice. Why is it not ice? Everything around it is ice. It turns out there's a geothermal vent down there that's warming up enough of it to keep it liquid, but again, this is the 6th largest lake on the planet, and it's under almost a mile of ice. 15-million-year-old ice. Geothermal vents, of course, are teeming with life in most places that they're found, but this particular place has been completely isolated from the rest of the world for 15 million years. There was a raging debate over what kind of sea creatures might live at the bottom of Lake Vostok for 2 decades. Scientists would get their answer in 1999, but more on that later. There's just something about us humans that we see a place like that remote, that isolated, that deadly, and we say, yeah, I'm totally gonna go there. So, starting in the early 20th century, it was also the site of a string of tragedies as explorers raced to be the first to the South Pole. And perhaps no explorer exemplifies the hubris of the so-called heroic age than Robert Falcon Scott. Robert Falcon Scott, besides having an amazing name, started his career as a respected British Navy officer. But in the 1890s, both his father and younger brother died unexpectedly, which made him the lone provider for his mother and sisters. So he became desperate to elevate his status. But there just weren't a lot of advancement opportunities in the Navy at the time. And then in 1899, while home on leave, he had a chance encounter with the president of the Royal Geographical Society, a guy named Clements Markham. And he was funding an expedition to the South Pole, and he needed a commander, so yeah, Robert Falcon Scott jumped at the chance. So in 1901, he set sail on his ship Discovery with fellow explorers Ernest Shackleton and Edward Wilson. And they didn't quite make it to the pole. Although they did reach 82 degrees latitude, which was the furthest south anybody had ever been at that time. But yeah, they eventually had to turn back with just 530 miles to go. This was actually kind of a disaster. They ran out of supplies, the crew all came down with scurvy, they had to resort to eating their sled dogs to survive, and still, Robert Falcon Scott wanted to press on. It was actually Shackleton who insisted that they turn back in order to save the crew. This actually led to a major falling out between the two of them that lasted for years. Still, Robert Falcon Scott returned to Britain a hero. They did cover new ground and made new geographical discoveries. There was a scientific component to this trip, so a lot of cool science was done. And to the British public, who had been kind of demoralized at this point in history, he was kind of like proof that Brit still had some fight and pluck in him. He got invited to Balmoral Castle by King Edward VII. He actually promoted him to the commander of the Royal Victorian Order. He became a toast of society for a while, and he eventually met and married a wealthy socialite named Kathleen Bruce. So in a way, he got exactly what he wanted from that trip. But deep down, it always really bothered him that he never quite got to the South Pole, and he kind of blamed Shackleton for holding him back. And publicly, he was really nice to Shackleton. They got along and whatnot, but in practice, he was pretty antagonistic. Like in 1907, Shackleton launched his own expedition to the South Pole, and Robert Falcon Scott forbid him from landing in the McMurdo Sound, which is the same place where the Discovery had landed when they went the last time. And at the time, it was by far the safest landing spot. But Scott insisted that that was his field of work, and he had rights to the area. So yeah, he was willing to put Shackleton's whole crew in more danger because of that. Swell dude. Shackleton landed there anyway on his ship, which was called the Nimrod, and they got a lot closer this time. They got to 88 degrees latitude. It was a mere 95 miles from the South Pole. But again, supplies ran out, dogs were eaten, and Shackleton made the decision to turn back to save his crew, which he succeeded at doing. They all made it back. Barely. By the way, this would happen again to Shackleton several years later on the Endurance. You might have heard the story of the Endurance. The ship basically got destroyed in the sea ice, and he and his crew were stranded there for about 4 months before they could be rescued. But they did all survive. So while Shackleton never quite made it to the South Pole, he did earn the reputation as a captain who, always put his crew first, even if it meant foregoing personal glory. Something that could not be said for Robert Falcon Scott. In November 1911, the ship Terra Nova landed on Ross Island, and from there, Robert Falcon Scott set off with a crew to the South Pole, which he was going to reach this time no matter what. For once and for all, he was going to beat Shackleton, and he was going to be the first human being to the South Pole. The crew faced all the usual hardships, including sled dog stew, but they pressed on, and on January 17, 1912, they did it. Robert Falcon Scott reached the South Pole, and what he found there was a Norwegian flag. Yeah, Roald Amundsen got there just a month before him. And he had no idea, at least not until he saw the flag planted there. So yeah, he and his crew, they turned around and headed back to their ship, which they never actually reached. One by one, they succumbed to the cold and starvation, including eventually the captain himself. And thus ended the career of Robert Falcon Scott. By the way, Roald Amundsen made getting to the South Pole look easy. Like, dude just crushed it. While everybody else had struggled and suffered and often died, he had actually trained with his crew extensively for years beforehand. And yeah, the whole thing went really smoothly. They got back to the boat 10 days early. Though it does need to be said, his entire mission was strictly competitive. Like, he was just there to get to the South Pole. There was no science component to it, whereas Scott's mission did have a science component to it. In fact, when rescue teams found their final resting place, they had on them the first fossils ever found in Antarctica. And this actually turned out to be one of the first big mysteries of Antarctica because these fossils were petrified wood, meaning Antarctica used to be covered in forests. What? This, of course, would go on to become part of the first early evidence of plate tectonics theory, basically proving that Antarctica used to be part of Pangaea and in a much more temperate region. But after Amundsen and Scott and Shackleton, technology improved and more explorers and scientists made a lot more discoveries in Antarctica. And with it, a lot more mysteries. So I talked about Lake Vostok and how deep under the ice it was. Well, there's another mysterious lake that's even deeper, and they called it, wait for it, Deep Lake. It's an inland lake in East Antarctica. It's about 55 meters below the sea level, and as you go deeper into it, the salinity increases drastically. It's about the same salt content as the Dead Sea. In fact, it's 10 times saltier than the ocean. But because of that salinity, the water never freezes, even though it gets down to negative 20 degrees Celsius. So you might think that nothing could possibly live in water that cold, but nope, something does live there. A study in 2008 showed that there's actually 3 species of a bacteria called Hyloarchaea, which makes up most of the biosphere there. Hyloarchaea, if you're not familiar with it, it's a single-cell organism that basically it thrives in salty water. There's also a green algae that grows on the lake surface, which is actually the main food source for the bacteria living down there. And like I said, there's 3 different species of Hyloarchaea, and they're all adapted to different parts of the lake. Like some like deeper locations, some like to eat the protein in the water, and some like to eat the sugars that the green algae produces. Speaking of algae, I mentioned earlier that 99% of Antarctica is covered in an ice sheet. Well, one of the few places that's not covered by an ice sheet is McMurdo Dry Valley, and it kind of looks like Mars there. But one interesting site there is Taylor Glacier, which has a 5-story waterfall that pours into Lake Bonny. What's interesting about this particular waterfall is it looks a lot like blood. Yeah, it looks like somebody just stabbed the glacier and it's bleeding out. So they named it Blood Falls, and only recently scientists have been able to figure out what makes it look that color. Yeah, Dr. Ken Livy is a scientist at Johns Hopkins University, and he used transmission electron microscopes to basically examine samples of the Blood Falls waters. And what he discovered were tiny, iron-rich nanospheres that oxidize, which turns the water red. And nanospheres apparently occur in nature. I think of nanospheres as like a molecular thing with graphite or something like that, but they are real things that happen in nature. They're about 1/100th the size of an average human red blood cell, and they've got their own unique chemical and physical characteristics. And these nanospheres come from a lake that's about 400 meters underground. It's very salty, and it's cut off from the air, so it just kind of like sits there, but it's very iron-rich, so once it seeps through the fissures and hits the air, the iron-rich water rusts, creating blood falls. Yeah, I've got to do it. Coming this Sunday to the Poughkeepsie Civic Center, Tokamak and Stellarator featuring Blood Falls. Get tattoos free. Antarctica's largest ice shelf is the Ross Ice Shelf, named after Dr. James Clark Ross, who discovered it in 1841. And when I say large, I mean it's about the size of France. It covers over 500,000 square kilometers. It's also several hundred meters thick. All of that, very interesting. What really makes it interesting is that it sings. Kind of. No, that is not the newest Aphex Twin single. That is an actual ice shelf vibrating. It's caused by winds blowing across the snow dunes that create vibrations on the surface, and those vibrations create seismic tones. The thing is, we can't actually hear those vibrations. They're seismic tones, so scientists have to use seismic sensors to hear the songs. What you're hearing has been ranged up quite a bit so that we can hear it. And it was discovered by accident. They were actually installing these seismic sensors to try to observe other things, and they kept hearing these sounds, and they didn't know where it was coming from. And also, the songs change based on environmental shifts like snow melting or moving. In the late 1950s, something really strange was discovered in the northern Wilkes Land in East Antarctica. It's a gravity anomaly, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's where there's a difference between the predicted value of gravity at a specific site and what's actually observed there. So yeah, there's just a place in Antarctica where gravity works differently. You know, that thing. What could cause gravity to work differently in a certain spot? Well, in this case, it looks like it was a giant impact crater. Yeah, studies have shown that there's an impact crater underneath the ice sheet that's 450 kilometers across, which would make it twice the size of the Chicxulub crater in Mexico. You know, the one that wiped out all the dinosaurs. NASA is actually who found this gravity anomaly as part of their Gravity Research and Climate Experiment mission in 2006. Now, there's still studies to be done here. It's not completely confirmed yet, but if this were an asteroid impact, they think it might have actually been strong enough to break up Gondwana land as the supercontinent that separated Australia and Antarctica. In 2017, a giant hole opened up in Antarctica. How big is this hole? It's the size of Ireland. It's a hole the size of Ireland. A hole. It's 78,000 square kilometers. It's actually the largest hole found in Antarctica since the 1970s, which implies that there were bigger holes found in the 70s? It's a structure called a polynya, which is basically an area of open water and sea ice. It's located in the Weddell Sea in the Southern Ocean, and it formed basically because the warmer water in the deeper parts of the sea pushed the warm water up, causing the ice on the surface to melt. And then as the water makes contact with the cooler surface water, it sinks again. And then it's reheated and pushed to the surface, and this goes on over and over again. Now there's a lot of these types of holes, these polynyas that have popped up in the sea ice all around Antarctica, but this one is massive, and they're still not exactly sure how one this big could form with the methods that they're aware of anyway. So it's a bit of a mystery. In 1964, the British Royal Navy's HMS Protector visited Beauvais Island, which is located here between the Cape of Good Hope and Antarctica. And while there, they found a lagoon and a waterlogged lifeboat. This boat didn't have any sails, didn't have any markings, just a nameless boat in a lagoon in a remote part of the world. They also found a pair of oars and a 44-gallon barrel, but they didn't find any signs of life or any human remains. It seemed to have just been this abandoned lifeboat, and nobody knows who abandoned it or where they went. Even weirder, in 1966, another expedition went to that same spot, and this time the lifeboat was gone. There was no mention of it. Like, it just disappeared. There are ghost ships. Are there ghost lifeboats? Because this might be a ghost lifeboat. And now that I've talked about ghost ships, it's time to pivot a little bit. Everything that I've talked about so far is just kind of like weird things that happen in a weird part of the world. There's some really crazy stuff going around about Antarctica. So let's get into that. About 10 years ago, a story started swirling around regarding Lake Vostok, which I was talking about earlier, and the life that might live down there. According to this story, a Russian drilling crew was working at Lake Vostok in 2012 when they came across apparently a monster octopus that they named Organism 46b. This monster octopus apparently had all the kind of qualities you would expect from an octopus. It was apparently really smart. It was actually able to disable the worker's radio. It paralyzed prey by releasing venom into the water, and it could shapeshift into other shapes, which octopuses are kind of famous for. And according to the story, the researchers were able to capture the octopus, but Russian authorities showed up and took it away and denied that it ever existed and that nothing was ever found there. And because of that, Organism 46b remains a mystery, and some even believe that Putin plans to breed the octopus as a bit of a military weapon. Thanks, Antarctica. Speaking of monsters, some people believe that Nazis built a secret base in Antarctica where they took Hitler at the end of World War II. There have been no shortage of Hitler actually survived stories that happened since World War II. This is just the Antarctica version of it. And people who believe in this story also believe that from this base they were able to defeat American and British military by shooting down their planes with the use of UFOs. The US did eventually destroy this base in the 1950s with nuclear weapons, but you wouldn't know this because various governments around the world have, of course, concealed all this knowledge. And if a Nazi base using UFOs for war wasn't enough to blow your mind, well, guess what? We have wound up exactly where we all expected to be. Aliens. Because, Nazis flying UFOs, that's crazy. It's actually aliens. And I guess it makes a little bit of sense. If there are aliens living here on planet Earth, why not go to the most desolate and isolated place in the world to set up a bit of a base and launch all your UFOs from? And of course, there's no shortage of photographs that have weird anomalies in it that you can't quite explain that look like UFOs. And last but not least are the stories about pyramids or ancient civilizations that have been buried under the ice of Antarctica. Some people believe that this might have been like an ancient Egyptian civilization with the pyramids and stuff. Some people believe it might have been Atlantis. After all, we know that Antarctica used to be a more tropical continent that was in a more suitable place for life and civilizations to flourish. If you're going to have an ancient city or civilization get buried underwater, why not get buried under ice? So what are we to make of all these crazy stories coming out of Antarctica, mysterious lifeboats, monster octopuses, aliens, Nazis? Well, here comes the wet blanket. So we can start with that mysterious lifeboat. So in the early 2010s, online researchers actually figured out what it was, and it turns out it was a Soviet Antarctic whaling fleet that visited Beauvais Island in November of 1958. People were sent ashore, but the bad weather set in and people were temporarily stranded. So there's not a whole lot of story behind this. A helicopter picked them up a few days later. They weren't stranded for very long, but they did leave the lifeboat behind in the lagoon. Why it disappeared later, it probably just sunk further down into the water. The monster octopus in Lake Vostok has a pretty simple explanation. It turns out, it's entirely a work of fiction. It can be traced back to a specific blog post by a guy named C. Michael Forsyth, who was a former writer for, yes, the Weekly World News. Remember when you would go to the grocery store and you would see the Weekly World News and you just knew that it was fiction and it wasn't real and it was just like fake stuff? Feels like we've lost a little bit of that lately. Yeah, I guess the Weekly World News isn't really around anymore, but he published this on his own personal blog page and it was clearly labeled fiction. I guess this is kind of like the Sergei Ponomarenko video that I did. It was a story that kind of took on a life of its own, and it turns out the whole thing was made up. But it's easy to believe because, yeah, colossal squid do exist in the Southern Ocean, but because it's a subglacial lake, it lacks sunlight, has those extremely cold temperatures, it's unlikely that a complex creature of that size could survive in it, especially something as big and complex as an octopus. Now, regarding all those pyramids that people claim to have found in Antarctica, it turns out that there's just a lot of mountains in the world that look like pyramids, especially when shot from above with the sunlight hitting it at a certain angle. And in Antarctica especially, you have a lot of like the tops of mountains kind of peeking out above the glacial ice, which it looks like the size of a pyramid, but it's actually a full-on mountain. You just don't see most of the mountain. This, by the way, is called a nunatak. That's a mountain or a hill surrounded by glacial ice. In fact, there's a whole range of mountains in Antarctica called the Ellsworth Mountain Range. It was discovered in 1935, and yeah, it features a lot of these pyramid-like shapes. This one in particular is 1,265 meters tall from the base of the mountain to the top, but all we really see is the top of that mountain sticking out of the ice. So yeah, it looks like pyramids to a lot of people. Now, as far as the Atlantis story goes, ice has covered Antarctica for 15 million years, which is way longer than humans have walked the Earth. So if we were somehow able to establish an ancient civilization at the South Pole, it would have only happened after everything was completely frozen over. Which seems impossible considering the temperatures and the fact that there's just not a whole lot of food there to stay warm and nourished. So yeah, stories about Atlantis are usually vague and lacked any solid facts. So like, yeah, when Asians and Europeans talked about unmapped places in the past, they could have been talking about Australia or Oceania. So now we get to the Nazi conspiracy theories, and here's the deal about that one. There's a little bit of truth to it. Nazis did actually land and camp in Antarctica, but it wasn't for a military base. It was for a whaling station so that Germany wouldn't have to be dependent on whale oil from Norway. The Germans actually landed in an area that was already claimed by Norway called the Dronning Maud Land. But, you know, they planted flags there and they called it Neuschwabenland. Sure, I pronounced that perfectly. But yeah, the area was abandoned by the Nazis in 1945, which makes sense because Nazis were out of power at that point. But yeah, thousands of scientists have visited that area since the 1950s. It's been mapped by satellite, aircraft. Nothing's there. And it is also true that the US and Britain conducted military and bombing operations around Antarctica. But those were test missions. They didn't have anything to do with Nazis well after the World War II. They seem to have been conflated with the Nazi base to create stories about secret missions and UFOs. It all just comes together into a nice conspiracy stew. And speaking of the sightings of UFOs that I was talking about, most of the crashed UFOs I was talking about can easily be explained as rocks or mountain peaks or tipped over icebergs. The fact of the matter is, Antarctica is a very strange alien landscape where things don't look normal because they're not normal, and it's just really easy to apply wild and crazy stuff to the things that you see that don't make sense to you. By the way, one more thing, I didn't even talk about this earlier, but the Earth isn't hollow and Antarctica isn't a gateway into the planet. The hollow Earth theory actually goes back to Edmund Halley, the same guy behind Halley's Comet, who came up with the idea in the 17th century. But this theory's been disproven since the 1730s, and modern science has proven that the Earth is actually composed of rock and iron. It's all right there. Trust the shirt, people. Now, what does make Antarctica really cool is all the research and scientific experiments that are being conducted there, including the life in Lake Vostok. No, it's not a monster octopus, but yes, they have found evidence of life down there. So in 1998, a joint team of scientists drilled an ice core down to Lake Vostok, looking for life. And by the way, if you're thinking to yourself, oh god, did they contaminate a potential ecosystem that's been kept pristine for 15 million years? Well, you're ahead of me. The team was made up of scientists from Russia, France, and the US, and the ice core they drilled was one of the deepest ice cores ever drilled. It went down 3,623 meters, or 11,886 feet. That's over 2 miles. They stopped, thankfully, about 100 meters above the water level, but even in that ice, they found extremophile microbes, so there's definitely life down there. In 2012, a Russian team got a bit more bold and were able to actually collect water from the lake. I know that sounds like they just dipped a ladle down there and took a sip, but they were actually really careful about it. So here's how they did it. They drilled down to like just above the water barrier and then slowly, just a little bit at a time, pushed forward until the pressure from underneath forced the water up into the borehole. And then they pulled the drill out as soon as the water went up there. That water then froze, which plugged up the hole. And then they drilled into that plug and collected a sample from that ice that was made from lake water. This method's been used several times since then, and there are samples that have been studied, and the consensus seems to be that there's a diverse and teeming ecosystem down there. DNA sequencing found over 3,500 unique gene sequences, 94% of which were bacteria, and 4% were from more advanced eukaryotes. These species were described mostly as what one would expect to find in, brackish water around deep sea sediments and thermal vents, but while the vast majority of the life that was found was unicellular organisms, there was some multicellular ones in there. Nothing much more complex than that, though. Except, a team in 2020 found DNA that was 97% similar to a type of rock cod that lives off the coast of Antarctica called Notothenia cordyceps. Now, most don't think that there's actual species of cod living down there. It's expected that's a contamination of some kind, because there has been some contamination. Yeah, Lake Vostok has been a bit of a flashpoint among environmentalists because water samples have shown traces of kerosene and antifreeze in it. Yeah, one of the problems that they ran into when they were drilling this, again, 2-mile-long borehole, is that sections of this borehole would freeze over. So the Russians started using kerosene and freon to keep the holes open and lubricated. And they didn't just use a little bit, they used 60 tons of the stuff. Now, it wasn't like they were just pouring it into the lake. There were only trace amounts that had been found in it, but still. Anyway, there's a whole debate around that, but that's just one thing that's been studied in Antarctica. We studied things like the ozone hole, million-year-old DNA, neutrinos from outer space, and evidence of fires during the time of the dinosaurs. Oh, and remember that Mars meteorite that they thought might have had fossilized bacteria in it? Yeah, that was found in Antarctica. They've also used Antarctica to study team dynamics for future missions to other planets. All of which is really cool, but this video is already running really long, so I'm going to add an extra section to the version that I upload to Nebula, because I can do whatever I want there. Yeah, in my last video, I used a clip from the Jetsons intro, and some copyright troll tried to get my video taken down. That's one of like 1,000 different things I have to think about when I post things on YouTube. And look, I love YouTube, but I gotta be honest, I kind of like not having to think about all that when I post on Nebula. YouTube rules don't apply there, because I make the rules. Now, there's been a lot of talk of creators starting their own streaming services, which, God bless, but Nebula's been doing this for years with hundreds of creators at this point, all of whom post early and ad-free, and like me, include additional content for our viewers. And Nebula's really been expanding lately, getting into original series like the ever-popular Jet Lag, Real Life Lore's War Room, and Neo's Underexposure series. Plus, there's a new news division run by TLDR News, and something I'm really excited about is they're getting into short and feature film productions, one of which I'm actually going to be helping out with next month. And it really is a place where the creators run the show, so if you really want to support a big old group of thoughtful creators and get access to all kinds of exclusive stuff, just click the link down in the description below, or scan this code right here. You can get 40% off your annual subscription. That comes out to $30, about $2.50 a month. Or if I've done such a good job of selling this and you have decided right here and now that you don't want to just sign up for Nebula, you want to have Nebula for the rest of your life. They do have a lifetime membership. It's $300. And I know that's oil tycoon money, but if you have it and you're interested, it does go almost directly toward new original content, including some things that I'm working on myself. So it's really like you're helping me get a dream project made, if that helps. Anyway, it's nebula.tv/Joe Scott. Your interest is much appreciated. Alright, thanks a lot for watching. If this is your first time here, these are the kind of things that I do on this channel. I talk about fun topics that increase your knowledge and make the world a little bit more interesting. So if you haven't seen any of my stuff before, this is new to you, maybe click down on the sidebar if you're on your website or on your computer. There's plenty of videos down there that the algorithm should be showing you, or you can just kind of take a look right here. Google thinks you might like that one. Take a look at them. I invite you to subscribe if you enjoy it. I do come back with videos every other Monday right now, usually every Monday. Anyway, that's it for now. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please share down in the comments what your favorite Antarctica fact is, if there's anything that I missed or whatnot. And outside of that, you guys have a good rest of your week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care.